Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another episode of the Daily Friend Show. I am your host, Nicholas Lorimer, and today I'm joined on a cold and rainy day in Johannesburg by Sara Gon. Sara, how are you doing?
I'm doing fine. I feel like I'm in Cape Town. So that should be cool.
Indeed, and joining us from Cape Town is Mr. Michael Morris. Michael, how are you?
Indeed, I'm fine, but also from a cold and rainy day. So yeah, touche, Sara.
Cold and rainy, miserable day to match the cold, rainy, and miserable news. But before we get into that, let us start with a word from our sponsor, Bitvice. Concerned about the poor performance of the South African rand and local investment returns when planning for your retirement? Look no further than Bitvice.io, the reputable white glove Bitcoin service designed to provide you with a secure and professional approach to navigating the world of Bitcoin. With a proven track record, Bitcoin offers potential growth opportunities amidst economic uncertainties. At Bitvice.io, we prioritize your security and empower you with self-custody, ensuring complete control and protection of your Bitcoin holdings. Discover the benefits of self-custody and secure your financial future with Bitvice.io. Visit our website today. There will be a link to that in the description. Right. Thank you very much to Bitvice for sponsoring us. And let's start off with some of the reaction and news coming out of the quarterly police crime statistics, which are not great at all. We've had thousands of people murdered in the big provinces, KZN, Gauteng, the Eastern Cape, with murder being up from the same period last year, with the number of murders in KZN being slightly higher than it was last year. Gauteng came in second with about 1,556 murders, and the Eastern Cape with 1,112. I think I'm correct in saying that the Western Cape did better than it has in past years in terms of murders. 10,500 rape cases have been opened during the first 3 months of this year, which is about 116 cases a day on average. Yeah. And now around almost 70 people were murdered every single day between January and March. I believe that crime does go up, I think, a bit in winter. So it's probably the average for the year, I suspect, will be higher than that 70%, which is just an appalling number. Michael, let me start with you. You know, as South Africans, we're sort of on one hand, we're very used to crime, right? We've had pretty bad crime in the country for many years. But it does feel like we're kind of heading back to the sort of madness of the 90s in terms of the level of crime. And I don't know, government is just sort of plodding along exactly as it is. Bheki Cele, who has been one of perhaps the least successful ministers after Julius Nkwesi, remains at the helm. What do you make of all this?
Yeah. I think you're absolutely right. This sense of sort of helpless vulnerability, I think, is universal, and the sense that nobody's really in charge, that there is no sense, acute sense of accountability that's clearly needed to get on top of crime. You have, I'm absolutely convinced of this, excellent people, individuals in various arms of the state service, and the courts and the police, the investigating unit, the forensic people, very, very fine people, I think, working in the background. Thanklessly, mostly it's a tragedy in a way of these circumstances that those kind of people are probably very rarely acknowledged for the work that they do. But the unfortunate thing is the wider context in which they're operating is one of inefficiency, fecklessness, lack of accountability, unconcern. People like Bheki Cele evidently unmoved by the crisis that he's confronting. He's quite happy to launch into tirades against activists who have engaged in sort of voluntary efforts to try and find solutions, try and help communities. He berates them. That becomes his great cause célèbre. It really is a tragedy. I was looking a bit earlier at Tony Leon's piece today, actually yesterday, in which he speaks about the headline actually captures it. in singling out three or a phrase and two words. Non-aligned is a phrase, president is a phrase, and pick up the rand. Sorry, the two words and the phrase. And he borrows from Thandi Modisa's, as he puts it, in delicate parliamentary language. In the headline, it says, "When words mean fuck all." And this is it. We talk about accountability. We talk about policing. Beccacelli will be making all kinds of statements, but these words actually have now come to be so devalued that ordinary people living with the risk of crime, the vulnerability to awful things happening to them at the rates that you describe, it's just too shocking. It's just become implausible, and it deepens this terrible sense of vulnerability that people have. They're simply afraid to go out, constantly anxious about where they are, who they're speaking to, distrusting other people, distrusting strangers, and so on. Terrible, absolutely awful.
Sara, what do you make of this? I know the Western Cape has been pushing forward with its idea for a sort of enhanced provincial police force. I forget exactly what they call it. It's like Western Cape Constables or something like that. I can't remember, but I think there's maybe some early signs that may be working. What do you make of these crime statistics? This seems to be, once again, I think there was polling done recently from Afrobarometer we talked about yesterday, and crime and security was the second most important issue to South Africans after unemployment.
And of course, one can't assume the one doesn't have to do with the other. I think the problem with the crime statistic is that it kind of doesn't matter from quarter to quarter. They sort of go up and down a little bit and up and down a little bit, but they don't fundamentally change. You still have your X number of murders a day and X number of rapes a day, and that pattern, that reality hasn't changed in a very, very long time. The other thing that's difficult, and I mean difficult even if you've got a good police force to manage, but although it certainly would help if they, if the investigative powers were stronger, ability, is that in fact most rapes, most murders are done by people who know the victim, vice versa. In other words, you're dealing with a social problem. You're not necessarily dealing with a huge crime problem. It manifests, and it's the police cannot solve the underlying issue. They can be part of the solution, improve policing, and I think the Western Cape's trying to do that. And for the first time, it's not the top, which is interesting. I think one has to watch this space. But when you've got people murdering family members, or a rival clan murdering another clan, etc., etc., you're dealing with issues that have got to be dealt with and sort of managed to the extent that you can completely differently. So it's a societal issue. Rape as well, and with a lot of these things, I think you have factors like alcohol. It reduces inhibitions hugely, and with rape, I think you often have part of the problem is, shall we say, not entirely enlightened attitudes towards women. So there's a sense of ownership and disregard. So it's much more complicated than just the numbers, but the numbers tell us that pretty much nothing's changing. And unless it's looked at holistically, and I don't think we have a government who can look at anything holistically and get its mind around it and do something, I don't think it's going to change much.
So some of the mentioned reasons for murders or causes of murders in most of these cases were arguments, which exactly what you speak to, Sara. I think being where most murders result from. Robberies, which is just sort of straightforward crime, but then also getting special mention was vigilantism, which is a significant part actually of the murder rate. Michael, what do you make of that?
I think you've raised two key things, as did Sara, and I thinking back, it seems so obvious I should have mentioned it too, but I'm glad that you did. crime is reflecting something else. It's not simply an inherent or innate criminality or new kind of strand of criminality that's in society. It reflects the enormous pressures, I think, that are being exerted on society by poverty, immiseration, lack of jobs, lack of opportunities, the disregard of people who are sitting in Parliament, having slap-up buffets, but churning out policy that's undermining the scope for people to find work, to get to kind of get by, to have some kind of stake in the economy. And this year alone, I mean, we've seen this whole string of things. The expropriation legislation is firing ahead. The national health policy is firing ahead. Who knows how many jobs, or how many jobs are going to be lost through that? How much immigration is going to be spurred by it. You have the employment equity legislation that's it's such a misnomer. It's clearly not going to achieve anything of the objectives it sets out to achieve, and is clearly not targeting the people who are desperately in need of help. But all these things are a reflection of exactly what Sara has mentioned: the kind of social pressures, people who don't have jobs and whose lives are a complete mess. Our colleague Maurice Root has mentioned this before, that wherever there's a single statistic of regarding unemployment, what we're talking about actually is a life in crisis. Somebody's day-to-day life is now in a complete and utter mess. They can't pay bills, they can't buy food, they can't look after their families properly. And you can imagine under those circumstances, as Sara says, arguments, tensions, you must kind of bubble up, and it's so difficult to contain all that. So what we're looking at in the crime figures is the evidence of what is happening to the fabric of society. And one of those dreadful things, of course, just to come back to your final point, Nicholas, is this overwhelming desire to do something about it, and you get vigilantism coming out of that. People saying, if the cops can't do it, it's just so bad, we're going to step in and just sort this out. And it's always unjust, it's always atrocious, and it's tragic. Yeah.
Exactly. And I think the thing that always most fascinates me about South Africa's crime problem is that there are societies in Africa and the world that are poorer, that have more dysfunctional states even than ours, and yet the level of violence in their societies is not as high. And I think that speaks to some of the sort of social problems which have many roots, but are not, I think, being addressed in the current era. Right. So with this story in mind, let's move on to a piece that was shared in our internal WhatsApp group that is driving me absolutely up the wall. It's from Melanie Verwoerd. It's an opinion piece written in News 24. And I'm just going to read from bits of this. The headline is EFF ANC coalition Steenhuisen stop with apartheid style fearmongering. Melanie Verwoerd says the DA's narrative on ANC-EFF coalition is a dangerous tactic that harks back to apartheid days as the party keeps playing fear politics. I have no time for fear-based politics. I had more than enough of that growing up under apartheid. Fear-based politics is the easiest way to control and manipulate people, particularly if the fear-mongering is based on half-truths, which it almost always is. If people are scared, they are far more likely to vote for someone who suggests they can mitigate the fearful outcome, even if they don't tell you how. Listening to John Steenhuisen and the DA's utterances in recent times, you can be forgiven for thinking that we were back in the time of P.W. Botha and the apartheid government. The narrative seems to be based on only one thing: generating fear for an ANC-EFF coalition past the 2024 general election. And just like that, we're back at the Roy EFF Gevaar combined with the general SWAT ANC Gevaar. And for good measure, also Soma, we will become Zimbabwe, or actually worse, Gevaar. The last thing we need is fearmongers who tell us, and the foreign media, in brackets, how stupid can you be, that unless you vote for them, we will tumble into the abyss of unrest and collapse. Really? There might be some evidence to suggest, in fact, that we are headed for something quite appalling, especially if the EFF joins the ANC in its disastrous policy consequence. We are already sitting with 70 people murdered a day, over 100 people raped. Almost half the country is sitting without a job. Economic growth is completely anemic. The power is off, or the power is off right now. At what point are we supposed to be slightly concerned about continuing down this path? In fact, a path enhanced with even more radicalism from the EFF. I would be curious to find out. Sorry, I'm losing my temper with Sara. Your thoughts?
You see, the problem is this is a sort of hangover from having had to become disillusioned with the ANC, but not being able to release them entirely from your life and your ideology, because Stevenson is right. I mean, we need more than anything not to have the ANC or the ANC and the EFF in government next year. I mean, because we've discussed it often, the fact that you cannot change they cannot change the mindset. The ideology is in the way. The inability to do things because people in government don't know how to do things, and therefore things stumble or corruption occurs or both. We are in a desperate state, and certainly the one reason I'd mention it to the overseas press is to indicate that there is, by implication, there's a better alternative, because that alternative is that very real option is not a good one. I mean, I'm not quite sure how bad it must be before we really be very careful about saying nasty things like, the ANC's ruining the country. The ANC's ruining the country. What can one say? It's very much Stephen Sachs sort of to say, well, isn't this very much apartheid sort of posturing? I'm a little older than Melanie, probably I don't know how much older, but I certainly remember a fair amount of apartheid, and the swart gevaar, rooi gevaar, the narrative and how it was done. We're not talking about the same thing at all. And of course, it's also, again, it's somewhere along the line, the implication is that this is that what's being said is being said by whites. And I don't know, judging by the pissed off people of all colors that I've come across recently, to say that the ANC is ruining the country is understating the situation.
It's so frustrating. We've had more than 10 years now of essentially stagnation or decline in almost every single thing you can think of. Economic growth has been pretty flat. In fact, in terms of GDP per capita, it's gone down over the last 10 years. Unemployment has either risen or gone or stayed flat. Crime has gone up since the low point in about 2008, 2009. And all of this has a direct connection to ANC policy. And what's so annoying about this opinion piece is that there's no reason, there's no sort of counter evidence presented by Melanie here as to why this is just fear-mongering. She says, she kind of speaks in these generalities. Fear-mongering is usually based on half-truths. Well, sometimes it isn't. Sometimes it's based on the truth. Like, it was not fear-mongering in in the 1930s to talk about the dangers of the Nazis and the Communist Party coming to power in Germany. Like, this is Michael, your thoughts?
Yeah, no, I completely agree. In fact, I mean, listening to your describing or reading her quote about saying horrible things in front of the foreign media, horror. If one thing reminded me of the apartheid years, it was this sensibility that whatever you do, don't be so disloyal as to be candid in front of the world. That this was the worst thing you could possibly do. I can't remember just at the moment particular instances of journalists coming under fire or worse things happening to people being detained and so on, simply for saying what the truth was. And unfortunately, for Melanie, that is the one thing in the piece that reminds me of the apartheid era. Mm-hmm. And for alerting South Africans and the world to what really is wrong, that is in fact a patriotic duty, and that is the patriotic duty that she's failed, unfortunately. Mm-hmm. And Sara's right, it's a terribly patronizing thing to immediately associate this criticism with some kind of racial white guilt apartheid thing, which simply isn't valid. It's just not valid. And it's out of touch. It's actually out of touch.
It's out of touch, yeah.
I like this comment from one of the listeners. Melanie Verwoerd needs to go and live in an informal settlement for a year without a paycheck. That is a reality for millions of people. She's sitting pretty. and can sprout all that nonsense. But that person who is living the hard life has a completely unvarnished view of how South Africa is going.
And as someone who has the misfortune of having to read the news every day and the opinion pages from time to time, I would also just like to see someone attack the DA in another way other than calling them racist, which is what she she does here. I worked for the DA for a bit. I have plenty of things to complain about. I have many opinions about many of the figures involved in it. But we don't see any of those. It's always just, well, they're either not popular enough or too racist. I mean, it's like the same conversation everyone's been having about the DA for 20 years. It's very boring. just maybe for the sake of writing a more interesting opinion piece, write something slightly different. Sarah, final thoughts of this one?
Just to pick up on the point you talked about the press dealing with the DA, I think people say DA must up its game, must speak to the people, must get its message across, and the media did a very good job of slamming it for being white and for being racist and harking back to apartheid and casting all sorts of aspersions on the DA instead of analysing what it saying what its policies were and analysing them, and the DA, it's very difficult for the DA to get out from under that. So, biased press was not solely an apartheid era phenomenon. But I'd love to take Stephen Saka to Nelson Mandela Bay and meet some of those shack dwellers who protested against getting rid of white mayor because he'd been effective. Now, some of the comments they made about the state of the nation were wonderful. I mean, they were really impressive.
From the sounds of it, those protesters would very much, I think, be keen on the Daily Friend show because they seem to have the same opinion as we do.
I mean, it was really, and it was absolute. It was just the sheer out there expressing it, no holds barred, no fear of, the Roy Gevaar or any other Gevaar. They were speaking whence they came, whence they knew, and they were speaking about the things that mattered to them and the things that politicians should be worrying about, not the stuff that people get obsessed with in the in the normal course in our politics.
Anyway, let's move on to something else before I absolutely lose my mind. And this is the Constitutional Court has, in a unanimous decision, thrown out the Traditional and Khoisan Leadership Act, which was aiming to kind of, I think, formalize who and who was not a Khoisan leader in the country. So we already have, it's kind of these weird hangovers from apartheid, is that we do actually still have different laws, different race groups. They're just not called that because, of course, we have the Traditional Leaders Act, but that tends to only recognize traditional leaders from Black communities. And so this was, I think, an attempt to kind of do the same thing for colored communities. And as one would expect, there was contention as to who the law would say was and was not a traditional and Khoisan leader, and that the law would require a lot of public participation. At least that's what its critics say. And the Constitutional Court agreed that the public participation process embarked on was just not up to standard. They gave some examples during the case of how in the Free State, members of the public were told to attend by local branches of the ANC and thought that the meetings were party events to discuss general service delivery and employment grievances. Now, to be fair, if you've ever been to any local public hearing on any law ever, about half of the people there stand up and complain about some local service delivery issue. So it's not entirely that thing. But anyway, the Constitutional Court says that this process was not sufficient and has thrown the law out and basically says it needs to be redone. The Constitutional Court said that it is a powerful reminder that the public participation is not just a formality, but a cornerstone of a just and inclusive society. Michael, your thoughts on this?
I was just thinking, I was reading, just as an aside, it's a passage from Trevelyan's account of his uncle, Lord Macaulay. And at some point in the 1830s, I think, or late 1820s, prior to the great reforms in British parliamentary and British politics, parliamentary practice and law. There had been some discussion about the creation of law and the involvement of the people, and a bishop whose name I forget, his contribution was to ask what making laws has to do with the people he didn't know, other than that they should simply obey them. And it's just, yeah. Fortunately, we have a constitutional court who will step in and say, if the people haven't participated adequately here, it's not good enough. And there are, I was thinking of that bishop's contribution to that very early debate on the ground, in the context of your saying that public hearings and public participation, I think, perhaps don't always yield the refined contributions that we might hope for, and that it could be a bit of a mishmash of complaint and grievance and so on. But it is nevertheless one of the key things that lawmaking must involve public discussion and the opportunity for people to contribute. And there are those like ourselves, the IRR, who spend a great deal of time looking at the legislation, thinking about most often how it can be improved when we aren't suggesting that it be thrown out altogether. But even in some cases coming up with an alternative, as we've done, I think, in the case of expropriation legislation. We accept that expropriation is a valid tool in the toolbox of any state, but that it should be done on a different basis. And we've actually proposed an alternative. So public hearings and public participation is very critical to lawmaking, which is accepted by the people, I think. And I think that's the key thing. So quite significant in my view. As to the content of the legislation, I've always been highly suspicious of neo-traditionalism and the retention of all these things. It seems to me invariably it leads to, reserves and funny sort of sentimental retention of all sorts of garb and so on, but there are people who take this very seriously, and one needs to factor that into the thing. People see their identity in those terms, perhaps, and there are, unfortunately, so many business opportunities related to these things. But what we saw recently, actually, the most telling case I think recently was the dispute over the site in Cape Town, where Amazon is due to set up its headquarters, and one of the organizations that had opposed it was then, it turned out to have no locus standi. It was deposed or replaced by some other organization, also with a very fancy sounding name, representing the traditional community. So there clearly is a need to smarten this up, but as the Constitutional Court has underlined, this process must be marked by public participation.
Sara, your thoughts?
I just wonder whether the ANC didn't provide sufficient public participation, rather the government didn't, because it doesn't know, and I don't say I know at all, but it doesn't know much about the structure of Khoisan living and living circumstances and the practices that they still support, and they don't know much about the leadership structures or who is a leader, who isn't a leader. So you do need to, you really need to make sure that everyone is canvassed and that you get a sense of who's an honest broker and who isn't, per the Amazon case. The other thing is, I don't know. I mean, I haven't seen the judgments. I don't know the details of it. But there's also a possibility, while many of the Black tribes, the African tribes, have distinct hierarchical tribal structures, it's may not necessarily be the same in 2023. Things do change.
I think we may have lost Sara there.
the government. I think the government. I think the government also perhaps saw that it was a relatively small. It affected a relatively small group of people and didn't pay enough attention. But I think it needs to get real, because if there is genuinely a hierarchy to establish and people want it, and they want things preserved per whatever the Act may say, well and good. But if not, point made by Michael, don't force it upon them.
Exactly.
It's funny. Just one last little thing here, Nicholas. Sorry to butt in, but the one thing it did strike me in the judge's comment, she refers to a background of centuries of colonial and oppressive regulation. But of course, one of the hallmarks, I think, of so much traditional structure is precisely that it is oppressive, and it is not hospitable to modern life and to what people want in 2023. That's exactly your point, I think. Yeah. Thanks, Nicholas.
No worries. And thank you very much, everyone, for listening. I hope you found the show interesting. We will be back tomorrow with the Daily Friend Show. Cheers, everyone, and have a wonderful day.